Block 4. Trauma and conflict. Trauma plays a role in conflict and communication by affecting our interpretation of the words and actions of others. How someone interprets what is being said will affect their response to us. If a memory of a previous trauma is triggered while communicating with someone, this can lead to a conflict or further conflict. The resulting action from the affected person could then trigger a response in the first person, starting a cycle. The response to these trauma triggers is called the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, or the primal survival instinct, which is a normal biological reaction in the body that happens in response to a perceived threat or danger. In the fight response, the person may become aggressive or show assertiveness. They may attempt to take over the situation and be experiencing anger or frustration. With the flight response, the person may look for a way out, to leave, or avoid the conflict. They may be experiencing fear or anxiety, and in the freeze response, the person experiences temporary immobility, feeling overwhelmed, stuck, or unable to act. In the fawn response, the person also experiences anxiety, desires approval, and will accommodate or comply with requests to avoid rejection or harm. The primal survival instinct is a subconscious response and can change based on the situation. This response leads to what is called a grievance narrative. A grievance narrative is a story that someone develops about a person based on their actions built from the other person's trauma response. For example, my children were abused by their father while in his custody. Yelling triggers a trauma response in them. When I yelled at my son in the conflict mentioned in Blog 2, he stormed upstairs. His flight response may have been activated following a trauma response. He would have been responding to his grievance narrative when he stormed upstairs instead of going out to apply for a job that would assist with finances in the household. Another example of the primal survival instinct is my oldest son, who has since moved out. He both freezes and starts to cry when yelled at, which could be an example of both the freeze and fawn response, which is out of anxiety. At work, I frequently see clients' fight response triggered. When they feel threatened, they quickly become aggressive and fights have occurred. Losing the security of housing is a trauma, and along with that comes a loss of belongings. It can be traumatic to lose everything you own if you are evicted, as is losing everything you own over and over with every shelter discharge. Our clients hold their limited belongings close to them, and theft is a serious thing, triggering these trauma responses. Fights often occur when there is even a suspicion of theft. Another example of responding from a grievance narrative is when my son was at CAMH and a nurse was misgendering him. I had corrected the nurse a couple of times. The nurse misgendered my son in front of him after being corrected. Instead of having a conversation with the nurse, I sent an email to patient relations regarding training of nurses on trans care. It is important to be aware of what we say because the impact of our words matters more than what our intent is. As the saying goes, impact over intent. Our intent may not be to harm someone, but it is more difficult to repair harm that has been caused than it is to consider what is being said before we say it. We do not know other people's traumas, and it is important to be aware of ways that our language and actions could harm someone. It is very easy to have someone we are communicating with go into fight, flight, freeze, fawn response if we are not aware of what we are saying or how we are communicating. It is also important to be aware of our own intersectional privileges and oppressions, along with the person we are communicating with, because power dynamics also impact trauma, conflicts, and communication. For example, if I am communicating with a client at work, the power dynamics of staff and client can affect the way we communicate through conflict. Another example is when my son has experienced a crisis and I have required outside assistance. He has trauma around TPS and related uniforms and is unable to communicate with them. In addition, it is important to consider his experience in the hospital as a trans male, such as being misgendered by the staff, as mentioned earlier. In that situation, there was the power dynamic of cis female nurse versus trans male patient. Another example is a client at work who frequently conflicted with staff. She was a black trans female. Not only is there a staff-client power dynamic, many staff at the time were also cisgender. There was also a higher number of white staff at the time as well. This could all impact the communication and re-triggering of any trauma responses from this client if language was not used appropriately or staff was not mindful of how they were communicating.